This intern session, we'll be looking at linear speed. And this will be obviously one of our first ones that we look at because a reason that the majority of our athletes come to train at our facility is to get faster. Whether they're specifically track and field athletes that are trying to improve in a certain event in track and field, or whether they're a team sport athlete and maybe speed or the capacity of speed is what they feel is holding them back. Now we work on a number of different factors, but speed is probably one of the most sought after physical capacities that an athlete can possess. And at our facility, we emphasize speed as much as anything else that we do. And so oftentimes the question that we get from parents or athletes is, can I get faster? And the answer is obviously yes. All of our athletes can get faster. Now, can they be relatively fast? That's not necessarily true. Obviously, genetics play a huge role in that thing, but all of our athletes can get faster. They can improve where they're currently at. They can definitely improve their speed. Now, will there be a finalist in 100-meter dash in the state track meet? That obviously not, but we can get our athletes faster. And the ways that we try to attack it are in these three main areas. It is trying to develop or improve the ability to apply a large force relative to their body mass. Then apply that force in a minimal amount of time, and then apply that force in a short amount of time in the correct direction, the correct orientation into the ground. Those kind of three factors is really what makes up and can develop speed. If you look at the bottom there, if one of those areas is lacking, that will obviously hinder an athlete's ability to maximize their potential and speed. So, for example, if an athlete is a very strong and powerful athlete and is able to put a large amount of force into the ground, but does so in a long fashion, they can't get on and off the ground in a quick fashion, or their technique and mechanics don't allow them to apply that force in a correct orientation, they're going to be slower than what their potential could be. I use the analogy of like a hammer. If there's a nail in a wall and I swing the hammer as hard as I can, so I'm developing a lot of force, but I miss the nail or I hit the nail at an awkward angle, am I actually successfully driving that nail into the wall? Well, of course not. So a large force but lacking the ability to orient that force in the correct direction or apply the force in a short amount of time is going to lead to slower than what that athlete could reach. In the same respect, if an athlete applies force in the correct direction, is able to apply that force in a short amount of time, but that force is relatively small to their body mass, again, they're not going to maximize their speed. So using that hammer analogy would be, maybe drawing back that hammer only 2 or 3 inches and then hitting that nail square in the head. Again, there's no force behind that correct orientation and ground contact, so we're not going to maximize speed. And you'll see this in athletes that kind of spin their wheels and don't go anywhere. They may hit some good shapes and good positions and may orient that force out of the ground pretty successfully, but there's no force behind it. So again, they're not going to maximize their speed as well. So with this equation, this is kind of how we go about trying to tackling speed. So we peel back the layers on some of these things. Let's first talk about applying big force. And we know that, again, the higher force relative to body mass that an athlete can apply to the ground, the faster they're going to run. Faster athletes, faster sprinters apply more force, both vertically and horizontally, during acceleration and max velocity. But be aware, understand that this force application in many ways is not necessarily related towards what an athlete can produce maximally, say in an isometric mid-thigh pull or a squat or a deadlift. We know that it takes a roughly half second to 7/10 of a second to apply maximal force production. We also know that the time spent on the ground, or the time that athletes are applying force during acceleration and during max velocity sprinting, is substantially less than that. During acceleration, it's around 2/10 of a second. During max velocity, it's around 1/10 of a second. And the actual amount of time that athletes are applying force during those ground contact times is actually half of their stance phase. So, for example, we'll talk about here in later is that the fastest athletes actually produce all their force during max velocity sprinting in the first 3 to 5 hundredths of a second while on the ground. So only half of that stance phase. So you can see there's a disconnect. The ability to have force at high force at slow velocities does not mean that that same high force will be applied at high velocities. They are two distinct different skills. And so, again, what this kind of stemmed from was back in actually the year 2000, Peter Wayne came out with a study that showed faster sprinters apply more vertical force into the ground. So every strength coach and speed coach after that was after we need to have the ability to apply more force. And they thought that the way to do this is by getting stronger in a weight room. So squats, deadlifts, Olympic lifts, isometric mid-thigh pulls. Can we enhance or improve our ability to apply large amounts of forces? Then that will be transferred into our ability to sprint faster, apply those forces when we're sprinting maximal speed or acceleration. And again, the current literature and the results showed that that was not necessarily the case or necessarily true. We also have to understand that lifting with the barbell or weight room activities is only one piece of the puzzle in terms of developing the ability to apply large amounts of force or to develop strength. We know that sprinting, the ground reaction forces during sprinting is 3 to 5 times body weight. The muscle forces during max velocity sprinting is anywhere from 5 to 7 times body weight. You think about sprinting, it can be seen as a force development activity. Bounding, skipping, pulling or pushing a sled or having resistance sprinting, jumping, different kind of hops, those can all be seen as different modes to develop more specific force development. So we have to get out of this mindset that the weight room or a barbell is the only means to enhance force production or force development, and it's not. Then we'll look at minimal time. We know that the faster the sprinters have shorter ground contact times. They spend less time on the ground, and during that time on the ground, they are more efficient and effective at applying force. How do they do this? They deform less. They are stiff on the ground. They do not collapse. Their heel doesn't collapse to the ground. They don't have that lower leg collapse. Their pelvis doesn't sink or collapse to one side. They transmit more force, as I talked about earlier, in the first 3 to 5 hundredths of a second on that ground. So I like to use the analogy like the tires on a car. Let's say you have a NASCAR that can, with a huge engine, a lot of horsepower, but that NASCAR has flat tires. Will that NASCAR reach its full speed potential? Absolutely not. Despite that huge engine, despite its maximal horsepower, it's not going to apply that horsepower, that power, into the track because the tires are lacking the ability to transmit that force. Same thing with our lower leg complex, our foot, our ankle complex. If we cannot transmit those forces, or we are collapsing, we are deforming on the ground, and we're dissipating the forces generated from our pelvis and our hips, we're not going to run to our maximal potential. Analogy we can use with our athletes is be a bouncy ball, not a beach ball or a flat basketball. We should be elastic on the ground, and that is a sign of transmitting higher percentage of those forces from the hips into the ground. So how can we do this? Again, we'll talk about in the next piece, improving our mechanical or technical pieces. If we can able to pre-tense and come striking the ground with good strike mechanics and have good preparation for the ground, we are going to be in a better position to transmit those forces. How do we train those things? Train it, I think, along the full spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you have kind of lower intensity things like ankle hops, or track coaches might call it the rudimentary series. Various ankle hops, low amplitude hopping, skipping, where we're teaching or the athletes are getting experience and exposure of how they should strike the ground, and they're developing a little bit more higher volume at low intensity, volume at connecting with the ground. So one end of the spectrum is higher volume, lower intensity hops, skips, things like that we do almost on a daily basis. We'll do those for higher volume, longer duration. At the other end of the spectrum, we'll have things that are higher intensity, but for lower volume. So like high depth jumps, high hurdle hops, maximal intent plyometrics, things like that, where sprinting can be seen in this regard. Towed sprinting or pulling a pulley or pushing a sled can be kind of seen closer to this end of the spectrum. So we're trying to train both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. And all of those things will help develop, I think, the ability for that lower leg complex to apply more forces in shorter amount of times. And finally, we have kind of the correct direction, the correct orientation, or for lack of maybe a better term, would be our mechanics or our technique in the sprinting. We know that sprinters are more effective at transmitting forces, and this comes back to what we just talked about, the mechanics and technical pieces, your postures, how you set up those certain shapes, during flight and during ground preparation will allow you to be more effective at applying and transmitting forces into the ground. Again, recent research by J.B. Morin suggests that more important than the actual magnitude of force, or just the total amount of force that an athlete is able to produce, is their ability to orient that force into the ground. It's that, like the analogy of that hammer. We might have, in many cases, sacrifice some magnitude of force, how hard we can swing the hammer, in ensuring that we hit that nail square on. So the orientation of the force is as important, if not more important, than the actual total amount of forces. So what it comes back to, if we have poor mechanics, and this can, will result in obviously our athletes being slower or more inefficient than they can be. But possibly more important is that there is a little bit more risk of potentially injury. The athletes are putting themselves in more compromised positions. They might be casting out their lower leg and landing out in front of their center mass, which is putting their hamstring complex at probably a little slightly higher risk of a potential hamstring injury. So we know that poor mechanics may result in higher risk of injury, but also will result in us being not as efficient and not maximizing our speed potential. Understand that technique and mechanics is a skill, and we have to treat it as such. Again, applying large force in the ground occur prior to ground contact, not during. And this is where that flight phase is very important. We'll talk about that in a second. So what do the best sprinters do? Well, they maximize propulsion. And they maximize propulsion by their mechanics. They maximize their propulsion by their ground preparation mechanics. And they maximize their propulsion by what they're doing on the ground. They land closer to their center of mass, and this leads to them ability to apply more horizontal forces while minimizing braking forces. Speed can be kind of seen as maximizing horizontal propulsion forces, while minimizing the braking forces will lead to speed. We know that the best sprinters we just talked about have shorter ground contact times, and they transmit more force during those times. So they're more efficient and effective during their ground contact times. They exhibit higher KPIs, or key performance indicators, in both technical and mechanical patterns. So they have greater front side mechanics. We'll talk about their knees are even at ground contact time. They exhibit typically better posture. And finally, best sprinters do not triple extend, and we'll talk about some of the negative side effects of this incessant need for coaches or athletes to focus on triple extension. So a couple quotes here by Ralph Mann. The first one here, he's a biomechanics researcher and also was a sprint coach. But we talked about sprinters do not actually fully extend because they're actively recovering their leg or foot off the ground before their foot is off the ground. So what this means is we're not trying to push all the way through the ground. We're not trying to push all the way through the full contact. As we said earlier, athletes are typically applying that force in the first half of the ground contact. The second half of that ground contact is them preparing or actively pulling that foot off the ground and to start that, initiate that recovery phase. So again, full extension is actually detrimental to many athletes' speed as they tend to over push, which will lead to higher backside mechanics, might lead to a forward tilt of the pelvis or the upper body. And this is kind of a dangerous cycle where the athletes now are exhibiting poor mechanics and postures because they're trying to push too long or out the backside of their sprint. Again, the orientation of total force applied during sprint is as important, if not more important, than the amount of force. And this was by J.B. Morin, a research group out of France that has been looking at some of the technical aspects of sprinting acceleration. So as we look at two things we'll talk about, the first one here is acceleration. So what are some of the characteristics of acceleration? We know that the ground contacts are roughly 0.2 of a second, with your faster athletes being slightly under that, and your slower, maybe more youth, novice athletes, maybe around that 1/4 of a second range. It's going to be exhibited by greater horizontal forces. Obviously, this is due to just body orientation. We don't have to get overly blown about horizontal versus vertical forces. In many cases, it just comes down to the orientation of our body. In acceleration, we're obviously at a forward angle. You can see that fourth bullet there, approximately 45 degrees. This is just a starting point. Athletes will vary to certain degrees off of this angle depending on their speed and their power capacities. Faster, more powerful athletes might be in that 35 to 40 range, while your slower, weaker youth athletes might be in the 55 to 60 range. It's a bandwidth there. But 45 is a kind of a good starting point, a good initial position to kind of talk to your athletes about the need to actually project out horizontally, not necessarily upward, but outward. But also not doing it at an angle that is detrimental to your second and third steps. We know that the the technique and ability to maximize that first step will compound in the second step and then compound in the third step and down the road. If we have a poor first step or we take too steep of an angle, our athlete, we're not going to be able to recover from that in our second and third step. It's just going to snowball into detrimental mechanics and positions each step down the track or down the field. We want to see that foot land underneath or behind our center of mass for the first 1 to 3 strides. That's very, very important. We don't want to see that lower leg casting out or landing in front of our center of mass. Again, this is key techniques that will maximize propulsion. During acceleration, our arms are there to assist horizontal propulsion. They're there to assist horizontal propulsion. So our swing arm forward, again, is to provide and assist momentum forward, while our arm that's swinging backward is there to swing backward to create kind of a platform or a backboard to apply more force against. So our arms are there to assist horizontal propulsion. So what to look for? We'll look at all these things. We'll look at hip separation, positive force angles, the ability to rise with each of our steps. Key words that I use or cues that we use for acceleration, words that match the characteristics of acceleration, which tends to be a little more patient. Our athletes have to be intentful and have to push fully through the ground. We're talking about project, push, drive, climb the stairs, words that mirror the characteristics of acceleration. And we'll see how that contrasts to max velocity here in a second. So what to look for? We start from the ground up. This is that toe off. So the two main positions we'll look at is toe off and that ground contact. Some coaches may look at middle of flight or strike phase, but for us at our facility, just to maximize time, we look at toe off and a ground contact. So a toe off, we look from the ground up for our foot. We're looking at that foot to be perpendicular or vertical to the ground. We don't want to see that shoe, the sole of the foot, at an obtuse angle compared to the ground. So we don't want to see that sole of the shoe facing towards the sky. It should be vertical. If it's facing towards the sky, that is a sign that they're overly pushing. They're pushing too long. Again, we need to have that foot recover off the ground and retract back forward. So again, that you can see the athlete's shoe here in the back is vertical. It's not at an angle where the heel would be to the left side in this picture of that big toe. It's vertical. We like to see a fairly straight line. There'll be, again, some bandwidth here, but a fairly straight line from heel through head. And that line should be parallel to the shin. Those two lines should be basically parallel. If that shin is more vertical, it is a sign that the athlete is casting out and likely going to strike out in front of their center of mass on their heel, which is going to create braking forces that we don't want. It's going to be inefficient. So we don't see those two red lines you can see there approximately parallel to each other. We move up the chain here towards the hips or the pelvis. If you look at the angle between the thighs, we want that angle approximately 100 degrees or more, okay? So we want to maximize that split. So we're, obviously maximizing our propulsion, and we're getting in a good elastic stretch through that posterior chain to be able to retract and drive back down into a track. So we want to see a 100-degree split between those thighs. I'm not overly concerned with the angle of that front thigh. It's more about the separation between those two hips, between the two thighs there you can see. Okay. What we'll look at next slide, we move up the slide here, would be the arms. I like to say opposite and equal. This creates timing. It creates rhythm. It creates efficiency. If you look at the blue circles, those are the opposite leg and opposite arm. They match themselves very similarly into the shapes and the intent. The arm is thrown back, to create a platform for that leg to help push back into the ground. While the red circles, you can see the shapes, the angles are very, very similar. The arm is swung forward to assist horizontal propulsion, while the knee is driven, again, forward, not necessarily up, but forward to assist in horizontal propulsion. The angles are very similar. A myth in sprinting, whether it be acceleration or max velocity, is to keep our elbows locked at 90 degrees. Just as our knees open and close and kind of oscillate, so should our elbows. They should match and mirror many of the same angles and shapes of our knees to create better timing and rhythm. And that's something that's often forgotten in sprinting, is how important rhythm and timing is. If we move forward here to, if this one won't move here to toe ground contact, we're looking at a couple things. We want to see that foot circled there. If you look at the ball of the foot, again, working from the ground up, we want to see that ball of the foot striking the ground. So midfoot, not our toes, but also not our heels, but our midfoot striking the ground. That ground contact, that position of the foot should be underneath or behind their center of mass, which you can see this athlete here is doing so. If you drew a straight line down from their belt buckle or their center of gravity, that foot contact would be behind or directly underneath that center of gravity. Again, if it's out in front, we are creating braking forces. During those first 3 steps, again, this will depend on the athlete's actual speed and physical capacities, but for any kind of, I'd say high school or above athlete, we should be seeking to have that foot land underneath or behind our center of gravity to maximize propulsion. Slower, weaker athletes, novice athletes, youth athletes may land a little bit in front of their center of mass because they don't have the physical capacities to own this position. And that's okay. But it'd be something that we should educate our athletes about. So that foot's landing underneath or behind our center of gravity. You can see that positive force angle with that red arrow. The shin is angled forward. Again, we want to have that thing approximately landing about 45 degrees that first step. The blue circles are the circles of the knees. We should see those knees fairly close to being stacked or side by side. This athlete could probably do a slightly better job with that position, maybe having a better switch in the air, but if there's a large gap between those knees, again, 2 things are usually the common culprits. The athlete is too low to the ground, so they're not, they're too low to the ground, they're not maximizing their ability to switch those limbs in the air, or they're pushing too long out the backside and not recovering that backside limb fast enough or quick enough or with the correct intent. So we want to see those knees fairly close to being even. Again, you can see the opposite and equal arms. The angles are still fairly similar. When that left knee, in this case, actually is even with the right knee or the right thigh, when those things are even, the arm should also be at the side. I call that coming back home together. Everything should be arriving back home at the same rate. Again, that is rhythm. That is timing. When those things are off, you'll see athletes that lack that rhythm and timing, and they're inefficient in their mechanics. The last thing we'll look for here is the ability to rise with each step, approximately anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees with each step. So if an athlete took their first step out at 45 degrees, second step's approximately 50, 55, and 60. Again, there's bandwidth here. Slower, weaker athletes might rise 10 degrees. By their 4th or 5th step, they might be fully upright because they lack the strength or power or speed capacities to have a patient drive. We also should know this, that with team and field court-based athletes, they might rise more rapidly, or their initial acceleration might be higher up because of the demands and the context of their sport. Their eyes have to be up. They might have to make a cut or a break off an opponent. They may have to, catch a ball that's higher up. So while I love and use track models and track characteristics to work with our team and field-based athletes, I understand that we have to deviate from those in many cases because our athletes play those sports, and the context and the situations and environments in the sports require athletes not necessarily to match and meet the same positions and postures and demands of a track athlete. Another thing people stress in acceleration would be like low heel recovery. For me, I think it's more a self-organization thing for our athletes. Again, for field, court-based athletes, they may need higher heel recovery. It may be beneficiary because you might have someone trying to swipe at your feet, whether it be football trying to make a tackle, or soccer trying to get the ball, or rugby, again, trying to make a tackle, things like that, where the athlete might need higher heel recovery during those initial acceleration steps because the demands of their sport require it. So the need for, say, track people to have low heel recovery, or to exaggerate with a toe drag, I do not think is necessary. Athletes will organize based on the context that they're performing in. So I don't think we have to get overly concerned about low heel recovery. But what we do want to see with the rise is our athletes should be rising. We don't want to see them hunched over and trying to stay low forever. Again, for an intermediate athlete, they may be fully upright by their 6th step, by their 6th or 7th step, which is like about 10 yards. While we want them to be patient and push out, and obviously that's more of a track model, for many athletes, they should be and can be upright by 10 yards. That's fully okay. But we want to see a gradual and rhythmic rise, not our athletes trying to force themselves to stay low. So as we transition here to more upright mechanics or max velocity mechanics, we'll look at some of the characteristics. Again, ground contact times are roughly half of that acceleration. Elite, so I'm sure most coaches don't have many athletes that are going sub a 1/10 of a second for ground contact times. We've done a study with 150 of our athletes, and we had one who who was a 10.400 guy. Only one person of all our athletes that was sub a tenth of a second. With the majority of your middle school, high school, even college age athletes, anywhere from 0.11 to 0.15. So those are ground contact times. So this max velocity be characterized by more upright posture. We talked about the ground reaction forces and muscle forces, how exceedingly high they are during sprinting. So that requires a lot of stiffness and ability to resist in those forces. And then during max velocity, our arms are there to assist vertical propulsion. So they change from horizontal during acceleration to more vertical propulsion. They assist in that aiding the ability to get vertically off the ground. So what do we look for? KPIs. We'll talk about those things. You can see here the key words. The cues will be different than acceleration. We shouldn't be using the same words to cue acceleration as we do max velocity because the characteristics are different. So we don't want words like push, drive, extend during max velocity because the characteristics are different. And you can see the top of the page that's a typo. It should be top end speed or max velocity mechanics, what to look for. We want words that kind of register a image or elicit an image in the athlete's brain and their intent to be very quick, elastic, sudden, quick off the ground. So words like snap, whip, pop, all elicit a very image of those characteristics that we want to kind of emphasize during max velocity. So what to look for? We talked about the yellow line there, stacked. So very stacked posture, head, shoulder, hips should be fairly on top of each other. We don't want to see that yellow line tilted backwards. It's okay to have a slightly, very slightly, maybe 0 to 5 degrees forward. Again, this is toe off. We'll look at toe off, and same thing, ground contact. Some coaches will look at different phases. Those are the two that we look at. If we look from the ground up at the back leg here, again, the same thing, acceleration. We want that toe vertical. It should not be, the toe should not be, in this case, the toe should not be to the left of the heels. So it's not pushing back behind us. We don't want to see that back thigh really super extended behind our body. So right here, this is probably the end capacity that we want our athletes extending. No further than this. We should not see that back knee locked out. That is an ultimate no-no. That back knee cannot be fully extended. It should have some bend in it, as you can see this athlete here. As we work up, we should see at least a 90-degree split between the thighs of our athletes. Okay, we don't want this to be excessively high, like 105 to 110 degrees, as that's usually a sign that they're getting probably kicking out the back end too far, so they're extending that back hip too much. That's usually a sign if that split between the thighs is over 105 degrees. So we're looking at that roughly 90 to 95 degrees is kind of ideal. That front knee should be roughly 90-degree angle. Okay, again, we shouldn't have, to maximize that 90-degree angle, we should see our shoelaces underneath our kneecap. Again, if that leg is casted forward, so it's in a obtuse angle, we don't want that. They're casting out too early. They're putting excessive strain on the hamstring. We also don't want to see that as an acute angle where the toes are behind the kneecap. Again, that's usually a sign of the athlete pushing out the backside and they're not getting a good switch of the limbs, or exchange of the limbs during this air time. Again, look at the arms, opposite and equal. The angles of the arms are fairly close and similar to the angles of the hips and the knees. We should see that back arm, the upper arm should be fairly close to parallel to the ground. So you take the elbow to the shoulder, that line is parallel to the ground. We should see that elbow angle at a fairly open angle with the arm clearing the butt. The front elbow should be, you can see here, just passing the midline or the chest of the athlete's body, with the hand driving upward at a relatively closed angle towards the chin or the cheek to assist in vertical propulsion. At toe, at ground contact, when the toe just connects with the ground, the number one KPI that we look for is, are the knees even at ground contact? So are they side by side at ground contact? That's the main thing. That's, for me, it's the number one KPI during max velocity. If an athlete is doing this, 90 to 95% of all the other mechanics are probably falling into place. So this is a good sign that they're getting good switch. They're exhibiting good posture. They're landing with their foot relatively close to the center of mass. Those are things that we look for. So again, working from the ground up. Shin, is the shin at a vertical angle at ground contact? Okay, if it's at vertical, that means we're probably landing as close as possible to our center of mass as possible. So that's anywhere from 6 to 8 centimeters in front of our center of mass. There are going to be automatically land out in front of our center of mass during max velocity. That is a given. You can't land underneath your hips. We do want a slight amount of braking in this case, but we don't want that foot to be, again, at an angle where it's out in front of our knee. So that shin would be angled in this case backwards. That's a sign of excessive braking mechanics, with that foot probably anywhere from 12 to 14 centimeters out in front of center mass. We don't want. We talked about knees should be stacked and even. We should see that heel tucked probably in this athlete a little bit higher to the butt. But again, it may be a sign of maybe a lack of anterior mobility or flexibility. But that heel should be kind of tucked underneath the fold of the butt or the upper hamstring. You can see here, like I talked about earlier, everything arrives back home at the same time. At contact, the arms should basically be even, just as our legs are even. So the arms are basically parallel to each other in almost identical angles, identical positions. Fairly tall posture. I tell my athletes, if I measure you in this position and I measured you against a wall, you should be the exact same height. So you should be at 100% of your height during this position. So we don't want to see our athletes collapse or anywhere from 3 to 4 inches below their normal height because their pelvis is dropping or they're collapsing at their ankle or heel complex. We want to see them tall and springy. Going back down to the foot, we want to see that initial contact mid-foot. Now the heel will give a love tap or tap the ground in this position. That's perfectly okay. We're not expecting them to run their toes. We're not expecting their heel to touch the ground. Their heel will touch the ground in this position. This is perfectly normal and okay. But we want to see that initial contact probably with our midfoot. Again, not casting out, landing with our heel, which would cause excessive braking forces through our body. So to wrap up here, some not so obvious thoughts with speed. One is, we'll talk about speed is often trained in static positions or static environments. So we don't think about transitional speed. As much as 60% of sprints in team sports are preceded by some sort of transition or locomotion, where an athlete, say in soccer, they're jogging or they're walking or they're shuffling or whatever it may be, they're backpedaling, and all of a sudden the ball comes to their area or an opponent comes to their area, and now they have to switch or transition gears into a sprint to close space or to open space or to gain possession of the ball. This goes back to, in many cases, I think we can do a much better job of training speed rather than these kind of isolated areas of 10-yard dashes and flying 10s. I think we can do a better job training speed in contextual environments where we're setting up tasks and environments where athletes are asked to sprint or accelerate to, whether it be gain possession of the ball, whether it be to close space on the defender, whether it be to running to a hip of an opponent, whatever it may be. I think we can do a much better job at training speed in contextual environments rather than just isolating it in kind of this sterile environment where it's just always, a fly 10 or a 10-yard dash. In that same thought, is speed is not always straight. Speed is curvilinear. Again, these things are different skills. So they've been shown that running around a circle or a curve or running in a contextual environment is not the same. They're actually two distinct qualities as running in say a 40-yard dash or a flying 10. Just because you exhibit speed in a fly 10 does not mean you exhibit speed, say, as a wide receiver running a route or trying to run away from a defender where you're carrying a ball, or you're running on a curved line, and you're trying to perceive and search for opportunities within that environment to exploit. Those are different skills. So we have to allow our athletes to have more experience and exposure in those environments, in my opinion. This will be a kind of a big one here, but acceleration is obviously king, but that there's an asterisk there in that you look at soccer and rugby, the majority of sprints in any kind of field or team or court-based sport are going to be 20 yards or 20 meters or less, right? So it's going to live on acceleration. But here's the thing. Acceleration is typically defined by a track and field model, where if you look at the 100-meter dash, the athletes are accelerating. So they're continuing to accelerate from anywhere from 50 to 60 meters, where they then hit top speed, and they carry that for, again, maybe 10 to 20 meters, and then they decelerate or try to hold on to that speed as long as possible for the last 20 to 30 meters. So that track and field model is oftentimes applied to a team sport model, and that's a bad idea because those are distinct race models for those track and field athletes to try to follow to maximize their sprint time in that race. It is, again, the content is derived by the context. In field and team court-based athletes, those athletes are reaching anywhere from 93 to 98% of their max velocity in 15 to 25 yards. Well, 93 to 98% of your max sprint velocity, that's top-end speed. So if you think about, even though the majority of sprints are 20 meters or less in field and team-based sports, well, those instances where athletes are having to sprint 15 to 25 yards, those are actually max velocity exposures for those athletes. So max velocity is an important quality for our athletes to possess. So many strength coaches will say, we only train acceleration, or we train more so acceleration than max velocity because sports are dominated by acceleration, not max velocity. But when you change our lens from a track and field lens, which is typically viewed, and actually do it to a team and a field-based lens, you'll understand that max velocity instances and occurrences occur a lot more than we typically thought. And those are oftentimes the most explosive or game-breaking plays in a game. So I think we need more exposure to some of those distances and more emphasis on the mechanics, and also giving our athletes exposure and experience to contextual environments that require athletes to sprint at near max velocity speeds. Other not so obvious thoughts would be speed should be trained from day one. Vader and Isserin talked about speed degrading anywhere from 5 to 7 days. So if we're not tapping or touching speed components on a weekly basis, we're doing our athletes a disservice. So speed should be trained from day one. Athletes do not need to go through a GPP phase in the offseason before they earn the right to maximally accelerate or hit max velocities. This should be trained from day one. Other not so obvious thoughts, one of the best speed enhancements that an athlete can do is improve their body composition. Just a 2% increase in body fat can increase a 40-yard dash by a quarter of a second. So improving body composition, we're talking about that's where the weight room can really benefit speed, is it improves our body composition. That's where nutrition comes into big play. Improving our body composition can be one of the fastest and easiest ways to improve our speed. Another not so obvious thought is over cueing. Again, as coaches, we love to give cues, we love to give feedback, we love to give thoughts to our athletes, but we should not over cue our athletes. We not want to create paralysis by analysis. Let our athletes be athletes. A much better concept would be to, again, design tasks or design and constraints that allow our athletes to kind of self-organize or interact with those constraints, and let those constraints be the coach rather than our words having to cue and direct their intention and attention internally. So whenever possible, use external cues. Whenever possible, I think we should be using constraints or tasks within the environment for athletes to organize over. That could be things like, pushing a sled or having a pulley, dragging a pulley, a 1080 sprint. We have like a pulley system. The other one would be like an extra genie, or pulling chains behind you. Those things naturally and inherently cause the athletes to organize their movement and behavior around that constraint, and organize in a much more efficient and effective mechanics and techniques without the athlete having to coach. Things like wickets are there to design our athletes to have a little bit more vertical orientations. They run over the wickets. They have possibly front side mechanics to allow them to strike the ground in a little more efficient positions. So those are all things that allow athletes to organize more intrinsically than a coach trying to extrinsically bombard our athletes with cues. And then rest periods. One of the biggest mistakes that I see with rest periods is it turns from speed training turns into conditioning. For every 10 yards of sprinting or acceleration that an athlete does, we should be giving them a minimum of 45 seconds to a minute of rest. Minimum. Again, so if an athlete runs a 20-yard dash, they should be getting a minimum of a minute and a half. That's the bare minimum to probably around 3 minutes of rest. So that 1 minute range is kind of a good guideline for coaches. So if, again, they run a 20-yard dash, they should be given 2 minutes of rest. That's a good kind of guideline in that regard. We have to ensure that we're training the qualities that we want, maximizing or emphasizing quality, and not turning this into conditioning or repeat sprint training. And why do we do this? Here's an example here. So we got two athletes, athlete A on the left, athlete B on the right. They both run a 5-second 40. Let's say during the offseason, they're football players. During the offseason for 4 months, athlete A trains for max velocity speed. So he maximizes rest recovery, maximizes quality over quantity. Athlete B, on the other hand, is like, I'm going to get tougher. I'm going to improve my conditioning. I'm going to improve my sprintability. So he trains in environments that don't allow maximal rest, maximal recovery. Rest periods are 20 to 30 seconds, but he's trying to improve his ability to repeat his 5-second 40-yard dash. So this is obviously a very simplified scenario, but I think it can give a good distinction for many coaches to see why I think sometimes raising the ceiling is a better idea than trying to improve conditioning or repeat spinability. So after 4 months, the athlete A is now down to a 4.8540. I think it's relatively reasonable an athlete to improve, a 1/10 and a half in 4 months, while athlete B is still at a 5-second 40 because he didn't really emphasize speed. Okay, so let's look at what happens in, say, in a football a series. Let's say they're both receivers or whatever it may be. Play one. Since they're both fresh, they run at their full speed. Play one, athlete A runs a 4.85, athlete B runs a 5.040. Who's going to win? Well, athlete A is going to win. All things being equal, he's going to win. He's faster. Okay, play two, who's going to win? You can see player A, his speed degrades or he slows down at a much higher rate than athlete B. Why? Because he didn't train for this. He trained for max velocity, so we may have compromised just a little bit his ability to repeat his sprint efforts. But who wins play two? Athlete A still wins, even though they can't repeat it at quite the same quality as athlete B. They have a higher capacity, so therefore they're still winning. Play three, what happens? Player A wins. Play four, what happens? Player A wins. Play five, who wins? Player A wins. Play six, finally by play six, the athlete that trained conditioning or repeat sprint ability finally is in a position where they would have the advantage over athlete A. But by play five, who knows what could happen? It could be an explosive play. The drive could already be over because the athlete A scored a touchdown. So that repeat sprint ability may not even come into factor in because the capacity of that athlete A may actually win the drive, win the series, in an earlier down. You can see how improving capacity in a sense actually improves the repeat sprint ability because they have a higher capacity, even though they drop out at a faster rate. So this is why I think we want to prioritize speed. So for my interns that are listening here, and we'll go over this in our next staff meeting, but for you guys, your goal is to really maximize your ability to develop your coaching eye in our 3-step bursts. We do those on a daily basis just about because they're vitally important. I want my athletes to be able to calibrate and organize their acceleration mechanics and their feel and their rhythm on a daily basis. Again, we talked about sprinting speed. Acceleration is a skill. Athletes need opportunities and experiences to calibrate and reorganize and attune their movements on a daily basis. So that's why 3-step bursts are so important. We're going to talk about, again, we talked about ways to set up constraints or tasks within the environment that allow our athletes to organize around those constraints and tasks. That's why we use acceleration ladders and wickets quite a bit. We'll talk about how to set those up, what to look for on those. But this was talking about sprinting, mechanics, acceleration, max velocity.